Humans have been consuming meat since the dawn of our existence. It's been our lifeline. Without meat, we go extinct thousands of years ago. Our ancestors used to have to travel hundreds of miles with the migrating herds just so they would have something filling to consume. We had to develop fishing just so we could get a consistent food source from our rivers, our lakes, and our oceans. And Minecraft just simply wouldn't be the same if you couldn't fire up a couple steaks on the furnace. If you really think about hunting in the context of time, it gets crazy. Hunting precedes agriculture, it precedes mathematics and economics, it precedes mono and polytheism, it precedes recorded human history itself. So it's no surprise that a ton of people still like to eat meat today. In fact, in 2024, the average American consumed 225 pounds of meat. That's almost 2/3 of a pound per day. And with global population expecting to hit 10 billion around the year 2050, the demand for meat is only going to increase. To keep costs down, the meat industry has proven that it's willing to put animals through inhumane conditions with the express purpose of being bred for one reason and one reason only, and that's to be killed for human consumption. These poor living conditions for these animals has created quite the rift in society, as if we didn't have enough of those already. Animal rights activists are becoming increasingly aggressive in their approach to fight for animal rights. PETA went as far as to suggest that non-meat eaters, vegans, and vegetarians should abstain from sex with meat eaters until they change their ways. Well, this sounds extreme. It's a testament to how serious some people are about the fair treatment of animals. There might just be a solution around the corner that would satisfy all parties. It would satisfy the rising demand for meat, it would keep animals safe and treated well, and it might just be here before you think. It's called meat culturing. I believe to understand where we are now and where we could potentially be going, it's paramount to understand how we got here. For much of human history, i.e., since we started growing crops and could actually settle in one place, meat was raised locally by individual communities and waste was very little. In fact, if you were of a poor socioeconomic status, you just never got the chance to eat meat in most cases. That all changed in the early 1900s when the Industrial Revolution took the United States and much of Europe by storm. As populations boomed and technologies advanced and we became more efficient as a society, the noble practice of raising meat locally, using the whole animal, and only killing what was necessary became largely obsolete. Winston Churchill was amongst the first influential figures to understand the crisis that would befall us. In 1931, he penned the following quote: "We shall escape the absurdity of growing a whole chicken to eat the breast or wing by growing these parts separately under a suitable medium." In the 1950s, a Dutch scientist named Wilhelm van Eelen postulated the idea of meat cultivation, inspired by his time as a prisoner of war during World War II. He saw firsthand what it was like to starve and live in inhumane conditions that many of the animals today find themselves in. In 1971, scientist Russell Ross became the first scientist to successfully culture meat in the form of a guinea pig aorta. Not something that's particularly edible, but it proved to the world that meat culturing had a future. Fast forward to 2001, and an elderly Van Eelen, along with a couple of other Dutch business partners, secured the first worldwide patent for meat culturing. It was then that Van Eelen became the father of meat culturing. And in 2013, Dutch scientist Mark Post, with the funding of Google co-founder Sergey Brin, manufactured the first successful meat-cultured burger. Its cost, $325,000. But it enacted a space race between different organizations such as NASA and PETA and other kinds of institutions to be able to be the first ones to make meat culturing a mainstream, everyday, accessible product. Today, we still haven't seen meat culture reach the grocery store shelves, but we're close. Let's dive into the magic of how this all works. When you examine the process of meat culturing, it's kind of a paradox. It's simple, yet complex. It's ingenious, yet how did anyone ever think of it? I would like to break it down into 5 simple, easy to follow steps. Biopsy, growth, scaffolding, brewing, and harvesting. Let's begin with step one, the biopsy. A sample of cells is taken from the desired animal. Those cells are examined for any sort of illness or deficiency. If the biopsy comes back clean, then the cells can move on to the next step, which is growth. The cells that are taken from the animal are stem cells, a special kind of stem cell called a myoblast. These are precursors to muscle cells. The interesting thing about stem cells, if you're not familiar with them, I like to think of them as the high schoolers of cells. They're somewhat developed, but their full potential isn't realized yet. They could go to college, they could join the trades, they could go into the military, they could pursue athletic or artistic dreams. The stem cells extracted from the desired animal have the ability to potentiate or turn into almost any kind of cell. With this in mind, scientists were really trying to determine if they could turn these stem cells into something that were edible. But first they needed to amplify the number of cells. To do this, the stem cells are placed in a growth medium with things like amino acids, carbohydrates, vitamins, things that will cause cellular division to happen at a rapid pace. And in this growth medium, after a couple weeks, a few stem cells turn into billions, if not trillions. Once you achieve the desired number of cells, something like billions or maybe even trillions, you can then take these cells and move them on to step 3, something known as the scaffold. To understand the scaffold, you need a basic understanding of something called the extracellular matrix, or ECM. ECM is just essentially chemical and physical properties that allow any living being to have structural integrity and just be able to function in general. Without the extracellular matrix, you wouldn't be a structurally sound being. Your lungs wouldn't be able to expand, your joints wouldn't be able to bend, and life itself would not exist. And lucky for us, it's possible. Using things like cellulose from plants or collagen as a base, you can input the cells into this base and the extracellular matrix is adhered to. You can actually grow physical pieces of meat. And once this scaffold starts to take a defined 3-dimensional shape, you can move on to step 4, and you can put the scaffold into something called, what I like to call, the brewing tank. It's essentially a bioreactor that mimics the internal conditions of the desired animal. So around 99 degrees Fahrenheit, there's oxygen, there's a carbon dioxide level of around 5%. And by mimicking the internal physiology of these animals, you can actually see the scaffold start to grow into something that's much bigger than what it started out as. Moreover, scientists figured out you could utilize something called mechanical stretching, which mimics exercise. This mechanical stretching allows for the meat to be more tender. It allows it to be stronger and more just what you would find in the grocery store. Not only that, but in this bioreactor, you can also implant fat cells, which encourage marbling. If you're not sure what marbling is, that's the kind of pink, red, alternating with the pale pattern. It's essentially like the fattiest and oftentimes the juiciest and most delectable part of the meat. Scientists were able to replicate this. And after some time in the bioreactor, once the desired product is achieved, it can then move on to the harvesting phase, where the meat is taken out of the bioreactor, it's tested for any sort of illness or any sort of deficiency, kind of like how in the biopsy stage, the initial stem cells were examined, and if it passes all the tests, it's in theory ready for human consumption. If history has taught us anything, it's that emerging technology, especially the first time you're introduced to it, faces a lot of challenges and roadblocks, and meat culturing is no exception to this. There are 3 primary roadblocks affecting meat culturing currently. The first major challenge for meat culturing is price. As I alluded to earlier, in 2013, the first meat cultured burger cost around $325,000 to produce. This does include research costs, but nonetheless very expensive. Today that figure is substantially cheaper, around $10 a burger to produce. That wouldn't be the price you'd see in the grocery store, it'd likely be much higher. But we're closer. It's safe to say, as the methods for producing this meat get more efficient, and as more people become aware of its potential, this cost will inevitably come down over time. The second challenge is the ethical debate. There are a lot of misconceptions when it comes to stem cells. As I had said earlier, they're very versatile and they're in every single part of your body. The most controversial type of stem cells is embryonic stem cell research, where you take an embryo, whether it be human or animal, and you essentially just harvest it for its stem cells to treat someone who is living already or in a further growth stage. The ethical debate comes in where, is it acceptable to produce an embryo that could one day grow to be a sentient being just to harvest it for its stem cells to fix somebody else? The difference with meat culturing is you're taking stem cells from an already living adult organism that is not affected in any way by the biopsy. So it's two different kinds of research, but you would still have some people who say that growing meat that can never become conscious in and of itself is unnatural and therefore immoral. I'm not here to tell you what to think, I'm just presenting the challenges. The last challenge that meat culturing faces is government and economic pushback. In the United States alone, the meat industry is responsible for over 500,000 jobs, from warehouse workers to foremen to truck drivers. To say that their jobs wouldn't be adversely affected by meat culturing would be foolish, because they absolutely would. So a lot of the research that's being funded now is not necessarily from governments, it's from independent institutions and individuals. Something as groundbreaking as meat culturing would have major implications for a lot of people. Some people will be affected very positively, others very negatively. It's similar to fossil fuels. As the fossil fuel industry becomes further and further obsolete, you're seeing entire communities of coal miners, of oil drillers, practically just abandon their post because there's no work to be found anymore. And the exact same thing could potentially happen with the meat industry, and it's something we have to be prepared for. To kind of summarize this entire segment, like I said, any new technology is going to come with its challenges. The question is, what are we going to do about it? So now that you understand the general outline of how meat culturing works and the challenges that it's currently facing, let's dive into some of the implications that it could have for you. First implication I'd like to talk about is whether or not lab-grown meat or cultured meat would be healthier. In theory, and there isn't a lot of research out on this yet, a lot of people think it would be, because as it currently stands, meat grown by our current methods uses a lot of antibiotics and other additives that have been linked to cancer and obesity. Because cultured meat is grown of a healthy animal's stem cells, then you don't really have the need for any of these additives. It is in theory possible that cellular replication could fail, lead to mutations when culturing meat, but these could be closely monitored and watched and corrected if that were to be the case. The second and probably the most interesting implication of meat culturing is its environmental impact. As it currently stands, if the United States were to fully switch over to meat culturing today, it would cut down on land use by 98%. It would cut down on greenhouse gas emissions by 92%. And it would cost 96% less water than our current methods for getting meat. This seems like it is golden in an era of climate change and uncertain conditions when it comes to our environment. However, we can't talk about the good without recognizing the bad. As I had alluded to earlier, the meat industry houses over 500,000 jobs for Americans. Most of these jobs would probably be lost just due to the fact that we wouldn't need them anymore. And so we have to ask ourselves a tough question. At what point does someone's job and livelihood, maybe something they've done their entire life, when does that become less important than the greater good, or less important than efficiency or progress? And this is a tough question we need to ask ourselves, and we need to be honest with ourselves. Because what if it were you? Because as it currently stands, meat culturing would also likely drive prices way down, as the supply essentially becomes limitless as cells can replicate millions and millions of times. I don't think anyone would be complaining about the prices, but again, a lot of people's livelihoods are at stake. So now it's time to get to the bottom line. When can we expect meat culturing to become mainstream? At its current trajectory, many experts predict by 2030, the grocery stores will be lined with cultured meat. I would like to stress that this video is by no means comprehensive. It was just a general Cliff Notes outline of the process, the challenges, and the implications that come with meat culture. I would love to hear what ideas, reservations, or ponderments that you come up with that maybe I didn't include in this video. And I would definitely like to hear whether or not when lab-grown meat becomes mainstream, would you eat it or would you stay away from it? In a world that's becoming more and more dominated by technology and AI, sometimes it's easy to forget that the human experience is fragile, unique, and independent from anything else in the universe. And giving ourselves up to something that's grown in a lab sounds scary, but at the same time, it makes a lot of sense. And this is why it's important to have places like this where you can come and discuss these things. Keep an open mind, and together we're all going to get through this. Thank you for watching, and stay curious.